So my name is Lee MacDonald. I'm one of the conveners of the session, along with Vicky, Carlos, and Pete Robichaud. This is the human influences on hydrogeomorphic processes across spatial scales and forested landscapes. You'll notice the pictures that have been showing. This session was really organized in memory of Scott Woods. Scott was a professor at the University of Montana who was an athlete, a mountaineer, and tragically got inoperable lung cancer and died at age 45. So his career was really starting to take off. He started working on roads, actually effects of timber harvest on snow, did some road erosion work, and then his career was really taking off as he got into fire stuff. And then, unfortunately, like I said, his life was very, very tragically cut short. And so we're not only honoring his scientific legacy, but also Scott as a person, because he is the kindest, most gentlest, nicest person you could ever meet. And unfortunately, that won't come through in the talks, but it certainly comes through in our memories. With that, we'd like to get started. And the first paper is given by Stefan Dürr, which is Wildfire Ash, its production and hydro-eco-geomorphic effects in forested landscapes, a topic very dear and near to Scott's heart and what he's working on with Stefan.
Thank you, Lee. Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be able to kick off this session with a topic that Scott felt very strongly about, and I have the pleasure to work with him over the last few years and get to know him better as a colleague and as a friend. I'm very sad about his passing away. We were born in the same year. So let's kick off straight away with ash. Scott has actually taken me to some field sites that were deeply covered in ash, and here we're actually looking at some ash in Portugal. He was always digging around the ground and got my interest even higher in terms of ash. I had some interest in that before, but he really kicked that off further, and I'm very grateful to him. He was a visiting fellow at Swansea University for 6 months, and he had already lung cancer, was treated at the time, and it was really, really great that we were able to work together, and he got an NSF grant funded through that, and that continues now his work and partly funds Vicky to be able to continue his legacy in terms of ash. Now, ash, why should we worry about it? Well, everybody who's worked on a wildfire-affected site will see it's black or it's grey, perhaps white in some places. In most areas, there will be some ash lying around on the forest floor, sometimes thick layers, sometimes thin layers. In this particular fire here, the Jekyll Lake fire that I was shown around with Vicky and Scott, they're deep ash layers, as you can see from the ruler down here on the left-hand side. And you think this may have implications, but before I discuss those implications in terms of geomorphology and hydrology, I'd just like a few introductory words about ash. It's poorly defined and poorly understood. If you look at the dictionary, for example, ash is considered a mineral component of an organic substance that's left after burning, and a lot of scientists view ash as that. So if we discuss ash, they often think, oh, hang on, it's just mineral matter. Another definition in the Oxford Dictionary is that it's a powdery residue left after the burning of a substance, which is probably more like what we, as post-fire scientists, perceive as ash. It is a mixture between, and we put this in a recent paper as a simple definition, a mixture between organic and inorganic material, with the organic material having been charred, left after burning. And it's a solid residue, tends to be a powdery substance. Now, this ash is often not considered in post-fire studies for a number of reasons. Now, we all talk about our pet subject that is not considered often enough, but that's not really what I mean. But ash doesn't really have a home discipline. If you are, it's not soil, it's not vegetation. What is it actually, and why should I worry about it? It's usually not recognized, except if you talk to ecologists. They're well aware of the fact that ash has a high nutrient content, is very important for the environment in terms of nutrient feedback into the soil system. But if you don't get to a burn site relatively soon after the fire, it's often gone. You won't recognize it. And in terms of funding, our funding often means that we don't get to burn sites long after the fire has occurred. And the ash can be washed away within a very short period, so you might not actually even see it if you go to a burn site, as you can see in the picture here on the right. One rainstorm has removed all the ash in this Spanish field site. Now, in terms of its production, how much ash is going to be there after a fire, it of course depends primarily on the fuel load, and then secondly, of course, on the combustion completeness of that fuel, and then also the ratio between atmospheric emission and what's being left behind. A lot of the ash can be ejected into the atmosphere and deposited elsewhere. There's relatively little data on this about ash deposition in general. The few papers that have measured ash depth, they basically give a a range between about 6 millimeters to 36 millimeters. Quite a few studies coming out of the US, one study out of Spain, one study coming out of Australia. So we can expect an ash layer to be rather thin, perhaps a few centimeters thick. But of course, in some cases, like the fire that Scott and Vicky showed me, it was 120 millimeters of ash. We were wading through that stuff. And again, you would think this should have some kind of implications. If you look at the physical properties of the material, bulk density can vary very strongly from 0.03 grams per cubic centimeters to about half a gram per cubic centimeters, which, if you compare that to the average soil, which is roughly about 1 cubic centimeters, is obviously much lighter than soil. It tends to have a very high porosity because of that, so it tends to have a higher porosity than soils. It can therefore store a substantial amount of water. Saturated hydraulic conductivity can be in the same range of a mineral soil, depending on which kind of soil type you're dealing with. It could be similar to a silty soil, for example. But of course, it's also prone to crusting. Ash can change very dramatically after the first rainfall event. On ash doesn't equal ash. It can vary strongly in terms of color, for example. If it's low temperature ash, it can be very dark, like here on the top. It can be water repellent, something that I didn't know about until relatively recently. If you go to the other extreme end, the high temperature ash tends to be white, and often there's a layer of white ash on top of black ash, high pH, and that tends to be wettable. But these types of ash can behave very differently in the environment. Here's an example on the bottom of water repellent ash from an eucalyptus wildfire, a beaker here with ash at the bottom, and this is the water layer at the top. It just doesn't go in. There's no infiltration whatsoever. Quite puzzling because it's a wildfire ash. You would think it should have been hot enough to destroy hydrophobic compounds, but it didn't. Now, until about 2000, there were basically two speculative ideas around what ash does in terms of hydrogeomorphology. One was that it increased the water storage capacity of the landscape and therefore induced runoff just because of this absorbent layer. The other one is that it generates clogging between the soil pores and therefore it increases runoff. But there was basically very little quantitative work available on this. And this has changed partly due to Scott. But this is my colleague Rick Shakespeare here wondering, what does ash do? Does it clog the soil? Does it increase? Does it decrease the runoff? What's going on? Now, of course, if it is a wettable absorbent layer on the land surface, it will store water and it reduces runoff. And there's a bunch of studies that have reported that. We know that. And there are a range of scenarios that you could envisage then. For example, if you have a post-fire landscape with no litter, relatively little ash, you would expect enhanced overland flow, particularly if you have a highly water-repellent soil, which you often have in forested landscapes after fire. If instead you have a thick ash layer lying around, and the storage capacity of that ash layer is not exceeded in rainfall, you can then expect no overland flow unless there is a high volume of rainfall or very high rainfall intensity over the landscape. But of course then you might exceed that critical threshold, you might have additional rainfall or high rainfall intensity, the ash layer can't cope anymore, and then you might get very high runoff coefficients, and with that you might entrain all that ash and have a lot of runoff and suspended sediment coming down the hill slope, organic rich suspended sediment. So you could have from no runoff to runoff with a lot of sediment coming off just because of a little bit extra rainfall. Now, how does pore clogging come into it? That's, of course, the other side of the story. And as I said, we have more papers now that looked into it, but again, work that Scott has been involved in and Vicky has been working on very much was basically to look what exactly happens when you add ash to a soil. When ash was added to a sandy loam, it reduced infiltration. There was pore clogging, as one would expect. But when the ash was added to a finer texture soil, there was no effect because the ash particle size wasn't sufficiently small to clog the pores in a finer texture soil. So again, it depends on what exactly we're dealing with, what kind of soil system we're dealing with in terms of what effect we can expect. So really, this is a diagram here. Shouldn't really show that, but of course it's highly complex. And all I want to show with this is from a PhD thesis by Merche Bodi, who's worked on ash through her entire PhD. And it basically all depends. We can't say that under certain, for a particular landscape, we can expect the response. It will depend, for example, is the rainfall intensity greater than the absorbance capacity or the saturated conductivity of the ash? Or overall, is the rainfall storage sufficient, or is the rainfall event small enough to be stored in the ash layer? So this is basically a fundamental distinction we have to make. And if one of them is the case, then Is the ash water repellent? Is there crusting, for example? Is there pore clogging? And so on and so on and so forth. So for every landscape, for every fire, there's no simple answer. It definitely depends on what in detail is happening. Of course, there are other effects of ash that are leading on to off-site effects. For example, it's been shown that ash can promote debris flow by increasing the viscosity of the initial debris flow and reducing the settling velocity. So ash can have a major role there once a runoff is actually being generated and can lead to quite significant off-site effects outside of the burn perimeter. Other effects you can have, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but what's well known, for example, is with the rich nutrient content of ash, if you bring this stuff into drinking water reservoirs or just into streams, for example, salmon streams, you can have a real problem. In this case here is on the bottom right-hand side, post-fire erosion after a big fire in Australia. That obviously happens during drought conditions. The reservoir levels are already low. If this ash is then transported into the reservoirs, dry summer temperatures, you get algal blooms, and then basically the water supply companies have to shut down the water supply, and they already have limited resources. And this has happened on various occasions in Australia, and this is a risk elsewhere as well. There's usually a water supply issue in the first place when you have drought conditions. Put a fire on top of this, warm conditions, then algal blooms can be a real headache. So that's outside of geomorphology as such, but it's probably, from a land management point of view and water supply point of view, one of the biggest issues in terms of ash. The other side of the coin is, of course, the burial of ash off-site. Ash can contain high amounts of organic compounds. These are charred organic compounds. If they're charred, they have a longer residence time in the environment. And in a sense, what you're generating here on the lower left-hand side is a carbon sink. This material will remain in situ for a long time and therefore can effectively be a long-term drawdown of atmospheric carbon whilst the fire site is recovering and all the carbon is going back into the vegetation. You still have that resilient carbon at the bottom. So to conclude, we know substantial amounts of ash can be produced, particularly in forested environments, less so in grassland fires, and the ash can have an effect on the environment. The amount and composition of ash depends on the fuel load, fuel characteristics, combustion efficiency, and it's hard to predict until you get to a site how much ash you are likely to find. Here comes the complication. The ash can have a profound effect on soil hydrology depending on the ash layer type, the thickness, the soil characteristics. Is the ash hydrophobic or not? Do we have a fine texture soil? Do we have a coarse texture soil? How much rainfall has the area received? Under which frequency? Has there been a rainfall that crusted the ash beforehand and then a subsequent rainfall event? All these parameters make basically the role of ash to predict very complicated. It can also protect the landscape. Clearly, it can store water, but it can also serve as a pollutant. There are some wider implications. I mean, we are expecting in many areas an increase in area burned and an increase in fire severity. So we would expect more production of us in general, and therefore perhaps more risk certainly to drinking water supply catchments, and also an increase in extreme rainfall events. So that threshold effect, to exceed the threshold of ash water storage, is perhaps more likely in the future in areas because rainfall intensities, certainly across some areas, are increasing with climate change. And with this, I'd like to finish and do a little bit of advertising. If you've got some good work, send it to us.
Stefan finished exactly on time, so we have a couple minutes for questions. Go ahead, Pete.
So if I compare, let's say, a black ash to a white ash, would they have different characteristics for clogging the soil pores?
In terms of particle size, probably. I guess Vicky would be a better placed to answer this. But I think the real problem with that in the first place is that you don't tend to have one or the other. You tend to have your white layer on the top, and then underneath you often have your black layer. So you have a multi-layered ash system, and you need to basically unravel, first of all, what you have there, and then how likely that is to travel down the soil. Because even the particle size of the white ash, let's say, it could clog your soil. It might not do so because the lower layer of ash is a blacker one, perhaps with a different particle size, so it may not transfer into the sublayer.
Can you, based on your experience, can you give us a sense as to your best guess as to how important the clogging is of ash?
No. Vicky can probably, because you've done a lot more work on this than I have.
Yeah, I'd still be safe and say no, but I think
Yeah,
I think the
'cause-
clogging effects are less than the other effects, when you
Right.
put it that way. I think it's a milder effect.
Other questions? If not, we'll move on to the next talk. Thank you very much, Stefan.
Thanks, Stefan.
A great introduction to the topic. So our next talk is utilizing remote sensing information to improve post-fire rainfall runoff predictions after the 2010 bullfire in the Sequoia National Forest by Mr. Kinoshita. Or Miss, sorry, Kinoshita.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Alicia, and I will be telling you about our recent project that we just concluded in the Sequoia National Forest. I unfortunately didn't know Scott. He sounds amazing. I wish I had, but just wanted to say that. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Brandon Hale, a master's student, and Terry Hogue. So increasing wildfires at the wildland-urban interface pose significant post-fire consequences to downstream communities. And so as a hydrologist, I'm interested in the uncertainty in the hydrologic response post-fire and post-storm. And so this talk's really about coupling in situ observations with remote sensing products to burn surfaces. And so we'll start with just looking at some previous recovery work and then continuing that in the Sequoia National Forest, looking at the post-fire hydrology and vegetation, and then ground truthing these vegetation indices. And the ultimate goal of this is really to just improve our understanding of hydrologic behavior and prediction tools, especially in these ungauged and inaccessible areas. So this previous study was kind of the focus of my dissertation, and it's looking at the hydrology and vegetation recovery in City Creek, which is watershed in the San Gabriel Mountains, which is just east of Los Angeles, and it was extensively burned by the old fire in 2003. And so what we're looking at here in this top plot here is it's really a long-term hydrology from water year 2000 to 2010. And so in this top part here, we have the precipitation. So all these really represent our storm seasons. And then you can see a corresponding runoff response with each storm season. And so what we noticed was there was a long-term runoff ratio was about 22%. And then post-fire, we saw elevated runoff, and it remained elevated for the next 7 to 8 years. And so we were interested in what was really controlling that and how long it takes for recovery to happen in this watershed. And so what we advocated was that looking at a long-term time series of vegetation indices can help us see, what controls the recovery of the watershed, instead of more traditional studies where it's like one field campaign or one satellite image, which is not completely representative, because you can see there's a lot of variability from this MODIS satellite product. And so MODIS is really, it's a 16-day average of the vegetation that's present, and it's a metric, and so it goes from 0 to 1, where 0 is there's not much coverage, and 1 means it's fully vegetated, and it's a 250 meter by 250 meter product. And so just some conclusions from that study was that we found burn severity and the slope aspect and the post-fire climate really affected the recovery. So what we're looking at here are confidence interval plots, and so we basically found the pre-fire average, and then we created these confidence intervals, and then we statistically tested whether or not each post-fire year was statistically similar to the pre-fire averages. And so you can see 2004 is the most statistically different from the pre-fire average, which makes sense since it's the first post-fire year right after all the vegetation has been removed. And 2005 actually was one of the wettest years on record in Los Angeles, and so that actually seemed to encourage or accelerate some regrowth, but it wasn't a sustained regrowth. And so you can see in the South Burn, we kind of go back towards statistically different from our pre-fire years. And then basically the South High Burn experienced more damage and slower recovery. And so that kind of leads us into this bullfire. So what that study really needed was more detailed storm response, and really are these metrics, are they working, and can they be used as an indicator for post-fire runoff? So the bullfire was in Kernville, and it's north of Los Angeles, and this is the bullfire fire perimeter, burned about 16,000 acres and was primarily low and moderate soil burn severity. And then the values at risk there were Kernville and Lake Isabella. And so the goals of this project were to develop relationships between the satellite imagery and also the rainfall runoff response. And so we established four sites. So we have a control site just north of the burn area, and then we have this nested site, which is, we called it Bullfire 2, and then Bullfire 1 is nested within it. And then across the river we have Bullfire 3. And then we wanted to use vegetation indices as a predictor for runoff response. So over the last 2 years, we've collected rainfall runoff data, and so at each, I keep losing the mouse. So at each outlet, we installed a stage recorder, and we also had tipping buckets, and that's where we got our rainfall runoff data. We surveyed channel cross-sections, and we also took vegetation transect measurements. And so the takeaway message from just this image is that things that would control some of the recovery would be that they're all mostly, the land cover is mostly shrubland and mostly moderately burned with west and east-facing slopes. And so just to give you a little idea of the post-fire climatology, since that's also going to affect the recovery of the watersheds, the average annual precipitation in Kernville is about 47 centimeters per year. So our first post-fire year, if you look at the annual averages, these are what we measured out in the field versus a regional precip gauge. This was a wetter than average year, and then the second post-fire year was a much drier than average year. So that's going to affect some of the recovery that we're seeing there. And this is just a picture of us in the field. So we've got the MODIS vegetation time series, and in the previous study we used EVI, the Enhanced Vegetation Index, but we wanted to look at another metric, NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. So in this top plot we have EVI, which ranges from 0 to 1, and then in this bottom plot we have NDVI, which really ranges from -1 to 1. And so this red line is the average EVI or NDVI over the entire, that Bullfire 2 study site. And then the blue is the average over the Bullfire 3 study site, and then we also have the average for the Bullfire control in green. And so this is our fire line. This is when the fire happened, and so you can immediately see that there's interannual and seasonal variability in the vegetation, but also this immediate decrease right after the fire. So it's detecting the drop-off in the vegetation. However, our control site remains relatively constant, so that's a good thing. So to look at the distribution of the vegetation indices, we created these box plots. And so in this top, we have EVI for the control site, and then we have NDVI for the control site as well. And so you can see that it remains relatively constant. And for just showing Bullfire 3, we have the EVI and also the NDVI. And so this 2011 and 2012, these are our post-fire years. And so again, you can see the drop-off in the amount of vegetation detected. Right, so it's also important to note that 2010 and 2011 had more precipitation than average. And so you can kind of see that here in the distribution in all of the box plots and for 2010. And even in 2011, even though it was a wetter than normal year, we do see some wider distribution, but it doesn't really help in bringing vegetation back to pre-fire conditions. And then also important to note that NDVI seems to show a larger spread and seems to capture more variability in the vegetation. And so that kind of leads us into now, well, how much do we trust these indices? And, you know, there's this increasing usage in remote sensing over these burn areas. I mean, it's convenient and easy to use, but there's still this uncertainty. So we worked with Jess Clark from the U.S. Forest Service, and he's from the Remote Sensing Center in Salt Lake City, and we basically went to these five fires over different years, and we sampled about 10 to 20 transects for each fire. And those all varied by slope aspect, vegetation type, elevation, and also just by recovery stage, so depending what year the fire was in. And then we developed regression equations to predict the percent cover on the ground versus what the satellite was seeing. So this was kind of the methodology. We used this 25-foot telescoping pole with a downward pointing camera, and then we took a basically a footprint was about 25 meters squared. We took about 4 to 10 photos along a transect with about 15 Brandon Hale paces, the master student, which is about 15 meters apart. And then we were able to randomly select about 400 points to classify. So this is basically what you would see, the image from the downward pointing camera. Sorry if you're colorblind. We actually use red and green to detect, to do our binary interpretation. So it's either there's cover or no cover, and we did the cover as living cover. And then we use Landsat 5 thematic mapper. It's a 30 meter by 30 meter, so a much higher resolution than the MODIS data that we've been using, which was 250 meter by 250 meter. And this is just really, we can get a better feel of what's going on the ground. And then we develop these vegetation indices. And so we use the reflectance bands, the near infrared and the red, to develop our NDVI and EVI. And then we use cloud-free Landsat images, and we composited for the growing season. And that's just to capture everything that grew up. You notice that in some of the time series from before, there was green up and dying off. It was quite variable. So to capture everything, we composite the growing season. And then we plotted it based on fire. And so you can see there's clustering already based on the recovery stage. So, for example, 2010, the bullfire, we see that there's a low vegetation detected by both satellite products, and then also on the ground there's lower percent coverage. So that's a good thing. So we developed these equations, and then we made these percent cover maps, and we applied them to 2 fires in Arizona. And so this is just a percent cover map of the Monument Fire in Arizona. And so basically each pixel represents a predicted ground cover value. And we classified the thresholds. So there's 3 colors there. So from 0 to 30% is red, not much coverage, all the way to 60 to 100%, which was green, and that's more coverage. So we were out there in March, and we did a qualitative assessment where we took our field map and we looked up at the slopes, and we're like, yeah, that does have some coverage, and that doesn't. So we're quite happy with how that was working out. And so just some concluding remarks. The transects and snapshots aren't really representative of recovery over time. And so that would really affect the predictions. But NDVI so far seems to be more sensitive than EVI in capturing the variability. And then, like I said, these regression equations were applied to the 2 Arizona fires, and we've been pretty impressed by the strong correlation between the NDVI and percent cover predicted by our model. So there's still a lot of work to be done. While in the bullfire, while we've been working out there, every 4 months we were doing the transects. And so basically we have this continuous photo interpretation database now, and hopefully that will provide us with more understanding on the process of the recovery and further validation for our regression model. And then also to continue our work, we just want to include more detailed rainfall runoff analysis and couple that with pre-storm Landsat vegetation and see if we can see how that affects our runoff response. And so, thank you. Wanted to acknowledge some of our student helpers. Some of them are here in the audience, so thank you very much. And I'd be happy to take questions if there's time.
Yes, we do.
Yes. Hi.
Was the remote sensing NDVI picking up senescent vegetation, or did you have to try to get out there when things were greened up?
For the remote, so what we did was we did that compilation. So we basically, from before we went out there, we added up everything that was growing. So we took all of the images, and that was our way of making sure we're capturing everything that was alive and not missing anything that had greened up prior to us being out there. Does that make sense?
I'll check with you afterwards.
Okay, sure.
I think maybe the question was, what about the dead stuff? Because that's very important cover and helps reduce
Right.
erosion, we think. And so were you incorporating that at all?
Not as much. I mean, that's why we're trying to correlate it through that. And so based on what was covered there,
Yeah, so in a dry environment, you could end
it'd
up
be
with...
kind of tough. And so we were originally using EVI because it was supposed to atmospherically correct and maybe pick up some of the drier stuff, made for like a semi-arid climate, but we've been finding that the NDVI seems to be more versatile.
Great. Any other questions? So we'll continue on with our series
Thank
of
you.
fire talks that is leading off the session. The next talk will be by Pete Robichaux, talking about measuring post-fire erosion using simulated rill experiments in Rocky Mountain forests. A number of us have observed that the rill erosion is a key component of sediment production on hill slopes after fires, and Pete's going to talk about that. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this, Bill Elliott, Joe Wagenbrenner, Bob Brown, Peter Jordan, and then Tom Williams from the University of Idaho. Rill erosion, as we're all aware, is a pretty dominant erosion process after fires. Probably 60 to 80% of the erosion that we see in the post-fire environment is from the concentrated flow because it has a greater shear stress on the soil. So we spend quite a bit of time measuring that particular component of the erosion process. So our objective on this particular study was to look at the post-fire runoff and erosion rates with concentrated flow and try to tease out some of the factors that will influence that erosion rate, especially when we go across sites or across the different wildfire sites in the western U.S. We decided to pick 8 of our sites where we did the exact same experiment. This is a concentrated flow experiment, and we wanted to look at just those sites and see what the differences are in some of the other site variables to help explain the different responses that we got. So the experiment, we set it up. It's about a 9-meter long rill that we create. We measure a bunch of pre-run values. During the experiment, we do it at 5 different flow rates, 12 minutes for each flow rate. The whole run lasts 1 hour. During the run, we measure the velocity and the rill width and the depth to get the cross-sectional area, and we also looked at we collect samples at the base. This is what it looks like. We add a green dye to the water so we can see it easier to measure our velocities. We use salt in the water in conductivity probes to measure velocity. So here's one of the lower flow rates as the water is coming down. You can see that it doesn't go in a single path per se. It can fan out, and then it kind of can concentrate again. So it depends on the microtopography going around logs or rocks or anything. You also see how the color has changed from the top to the bottom. It's picking up more of that sediment. And here's our collection system 9 meters down below where we take our time samples. So with each of these different flow rates, we can calculate the runoff rate and the sediment flux rate and the velocity. Details of all this is provided. So when we looked at our 8 sites, the first thing we noticed is that the soil texture were all very similar. They're all down here in the bottom of the triangle. So we had very little clay in these sites. And the reason why we wanted to do that, because when I looked at the sediment flux rates, so that's grams per second. So let's say if I've got a 5 grams per second and it takes 10 seconds to fill my liter bottle, 5 times 10 would be 50 grams of sediment in a 1 liter bottle. Okay, so we're talking a lot of material that's being moved. But we also see down near the bottom that some of these sites down here, we have low values. And these are all high burn severity conditions and exact same experiment. So we said, well, we do see, if we do it over the years, we see a decreasing trend, but we also see that there's quite a bit of variability. Can we figure out and tease out what's causing that variability? That was the goal. So the first thing we looked at would be the bare soil. And yeah, you can see a trend that increased in that bare soil would get an increase in the sediment flux because you have more soil that's being exposed to that water that's flowing over it. Kind of makes sense. And as we increase the amount of water that comes off, we see that as well as influencing. We looked at the water repellency of the site, and not quite as clear.
It's not to say that repellency isn't an important component here. It is an important component, but it didn't tease out to tie the actual repellency to the amount of sediment that we got. Okay? Well, let's look at the runoff rates. And again, if you keep an eye on some of the color of the lines near the top versus the color of the lines near the bottom, so they're just showing there are different sites. So we say, okay, some of these produce more runoff than the other ones, so they're probably the ones that are going to produce more sediment. So I'll just overlay that sediment flux right over the top of that, and it doesn't fall exactly. The school fire site right here was still high in both, and the Tower site, but this dotted line down here, the tripod site, didn't follow that same trend. So we said, well, it's not just the runoff then, it must be something else. We said, oh, well, let's go back to the geology of each of these sites, because the parent material would have a big say as to how erodible it would be. So here's a quartz, basically right near your granitic type soils. These are your basalt soils on another site. We had a high sediment flux rate there on one of them, a medium on another. Here's the Hayman site, which is a granitic rock, and we had a medium sediment flux rate. Oh, the tripod, another granitic. Okay, well, that was still a lower medium. On North 25, a nice type rock, which is early stages of a granitics. So, okay, that's a low medium sediment flux rate. Here's a mudstone, right? So that had a small, so that's a sedimentary rock. That had a small sediment flux rate. And then we had another granitic that had a low sediment flux rate. So the geology by itself didn't exactly answer everything. Generally, the granitics and the volcanics were more erodible, but it certainly wasn't that case all the way across. So, well, what else could it be? All right, well, let's look at the particle size of the material that could be moved by that water. So we're trying to look at the surface soil. So this is the surface 1 or 2 centimeters on all these burn sites. Okay, and you'll note that when we have a curve that looks like this, the soil is much more uniform, and when they look like this, it's going to be less uniform. The other thing to note is down here. We have very little clays in any of these soils, but we do have a difference in the amount of silts in the soils. And if we have more silts, the soil will be more cohesive, and we would probably get less runoff. We said, well, okay, that might help answer some of this. Let's take a look in an electron microscope at the actual particles and also look at the shape of the particles, see if that helps us. So on the left, we have the less uniform soils over here from the Hayman. So at this 100 micron scale, you can see that, yeah, there's a range of particle size. And over here on the tripod, everything is much more uniform. And if I zoom in at the 10 micron scale, you can see that same thing. So we did see it. We can explain some of this by that uniformity of those soil particles. Okay. Well, the other component would be, what about the organic matter in the surface soil after this fire? What role does that play? And we see that does play an important role. So our organic matter went from about 4 to 9%. And we see that when we have the higher organic, it corresponds to the sites that had the least amount of sediment flux. So the Terrace Mountain, which is the red one, the green one, the Red Eagle, which is way over here. So that helped explain part of what we saw. Well, under the electron microscope, what was interesting, when you start looking at the actual soil on those soil particles, you also can pick up really fine and small pieces of that organic matter. And that's what we're showing here, and how, let's say, it can help make an aggregate right there and here at these two sites. And here's a piece of organic. You can see that long shape of a fine root that was still left after the fire. And then down here on this site, this is kind of interesting. You can see a piece of organic or charcoal, and when we zoomed into that at the 10 micron, you can actually see some of that cell structure that would be an agent that is going to help reduce that material from moving down the slope. So yes, organic matter was an important component. So what did we learn out of all this? When we compared across sites, that yes, we do have a sediment flux and runoff. They are much greater than they are in the unburned conditions. They are variable between the sites, and that they tended to decrease over time. When we had some of the sites, we were able to go back multiple times. Related to the bare soil, pretty strong, correlations or ideas that that bare soil would help us explain the differences between our sites. The organic matter in that soil, what's left. So that would tell us something about how much heat was generated that went down into that soil. Because if the heat wasn't that great, it wouldn't necessarily consume and burn up all of that organic matter. That organic matter is an important component to help hold that soil together. The gradation of the soils. Again, these were all very similar sandy loam type soils, but yet a little bit of change in that silt content did make a difference. The uniformity of the soil on one of the volcanic sites, very uniform, much more erodible than when you have a variety of particle size. And then the parent material, generally the granitics were more erodible, but it certainly wasn't the case all across the board. So with that, we think that studying these rills is important, and we're fortunate to have a large data set to be able to compare across sites. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Again, the speaker's done an excellent job. Do we have time? We have time for questions. Does anybody have a question?
Stefan.
Pete, I'm intrigued by the role of the organic matter in there, but what I might have missed is whether the organic matter content to begin with would have been the same, or whether those sites already had low organic matter content and therefore perhaps less root structure and having the soil more erodible in the first place without the impact of organic matter on water speed.
Repeat the question.
So the question was, how about in the pre-fire condition, is the organic matter high in some sites versus some of the other sites being lower? Well, in a forest environment, generally, organic matter is really high. I mean, compare it to an agricultural soil, which is tilled up, every 6 months. They have very low organic matter in a comparative sense. So I'd say generally all of these sites have high organic matter. We didn't necessarily take a sample and measure that pre-fire or from a nearby area, but probably be a good idea. But my inclination would be, though, that it's going to be pretty high all across the sites.
In the video, we saw how vulnerable the flow is to microtopography.
Yeah.
Is there an attempt to try to address that issue or include it in your analysis? I mean, the tendency for one surface versus the other to concentrate flow. I'm thinking about the mechanics of the erosion, the energy.
Yeah, what we'll see if we do 3 or 4 plots right next to each other, and one of them, the flow maybe come down in just 3 distinct rills, and the next plot, it spreads out. When it comes into those 3 distinct rills, we'll have a much higher sediment flux. So it definitely makes a difference to determine that pattern. Very, very difficult because it just slight changes in the microtopography makes a big difference in that. So no, we have not quantified that.
So kind of a follow-up question to Carlos, have you looked at rock content then?
The question was, did we look at rock content? And we have a surface cover rock content, and I didn't show that, but they were all about the same. It didn't really tease out to anything, so I didn't show that one.
How about the differences between runoff versus sediment yield? Do the same factors more or less have the same importance, or runoff didn't vary that much?
No, well, they didn't follow. That was the thing that was interesting. It didn't follow. Right. So we would say that some of the factors would affect runoff more than the sediment, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pete.
Yeah, thanks.
We just need more data sets, right? So then we can figure it all out. We need another 100 years of this stuff. So the last fire talk, although actually my talk also turned to fire to a certain extent, is by Pete Wohlgemuth, and that's about using aerial hydromulch in post-fire Chaparral in Southern California, effectiveness and consequences, what to do about all this erosion.
Thank you. So wildfires can set the stage for accelerated runoff and sediment production from burned landscapes, and the Forest Service, being a land management agency, has seen it prudent to apply mitigation measures to try to minimize some of these negative consequences. However, the effectiveness and maybe side effects of some of these mitigation measures are still poorly understood, so I'm going to be reporting today on some results of a particular mitigation measure that's coming into more and more use these days, aerial hydromulch in Southern California Chaparral. Just click here.
Yep.
So I need to acknowledge my partners in this operation, also the co-authors, Pete Robichaud and Jan Byers. Funding partners included the National Forest Service, National Bear Team, especially R5 Bear Coordinator Brent Roth. Operational partners include the Cleveland National Forest and the Los Padres National Forest, along with the U.S. Geological Survey, who provide us some rainfall data. For those of you who don't know where Southern California is or what it looks like, here's a great satellite view. The idea is that you have this coastal plain surrounded by mountains with deserts in the interior. We have a Mediterranean climate, which means the rainfall comes in the wintertime. Active tectonic uplift, non-cohesive soils. Chaparral vegetation dominates below elevations of about 4,000 feet. And fire is the dominant disturbance event, not only for the ecological terrain, but also it's been suggested for physical environments as well. So fire in Chaparral, you have fire-adapted semi-arid landscapes that can produce this accelerated watershed erosion and sediment production. It affects both natural resources in situ and also the wildland-urban interface, where it can threaten life, property, and infrastructure in downstream human communities. So mitigation, we try to minimize these negative consequences to life, property, and infrastructure, also the loss of site productivity, and in Southern California, endangered species and their habitat are particularly important. The intent of emergency rehabilitation is to provide cost-effective landscape-level erosion control that will reduce and delay accelerated runoff and sediment yield until the watersheds can function normally again. And we hope that the treatments are environmentally benign, including ground disturbance. We can treat roads, stream channels, but most of the effort is directed towards the hillside slopes, where you can have ground covers, mechanical barriers, or chemical sprays to alter the hydrology. Obviously, aerial hydromulch is a type of ground cover. Specifically, aerial hydromulch, or hydromulch in general, is a water-based spray cover. It's a wood or paper mulch matrix with a water-resistant tackifier. The whole thing together is loosely called a bonded fiber matrix. It applied at fairly high application rates, and it dries to a permeable crust that's supposed to be both able to be infiltrated by water, and the plants can germinate through it. This is what it looks like when it's being applied, nice and green so the pilots can see where it's been. It dries to a more natural earth tone. You can see a little inset there what the permeable crust looks like. And you can see the ground cover it provides compared to the untreated nearby sites. Issues revolved around hydromulch is that it's very costly. The erosion reduction has not been quantitatively demonstrated in rigorous field studies, and the effects on vegetation development are virtually unknown. So the objectives of this presentation are to see or answer these questions: does aerial hydromulch reduce hill slope erosion? Does it work? And what are the effects on vegetation regrowth? So we have 3 study sites in Southern California: the Santiago Fire in 2007 in northeastern Orange County on the Cleveland National Forest, the Gap Fire 2008 on the Los Padres National Forest and the upper ranges of the San Ynez Mountain chain, and then the 2009 Jesucita Fire, which burned also in the San Ynez Mountains right down into the city of Santa Barbara. Study site characteristics, they're roughly replicates of each other. The ACC site's a little lower, a little steeper slopes, has a little different aspects. The Santiago site's a little higher and has a slightly different geology. We measured rainfall, both amounts and intensities. Following Robichaud and Brown, we created these silt fences that sample about a 5-meter swath of hill slope, capturing erosion, which is cleaned out the old-fashioned way by shovels and buckets, and field scale moisture samples are taken and corrected for soil moisture. Cover, both the ground cover and the foliar cover are measured in these 1 by 1 meter quadrants and a 10 by 10 grid, 100 points, laid out in a fashion that looks like this, so you can sample the contributing area of the silt fence without walking all over it. So the results, ground cover is broken down into these 3 components. You have the treatment itself in red, organic component, this is stuff on the ground itself, so this is plant bases, stumps, and eventually organic litter right on the ground in green, and the bare soil is in blue. So bare soil is what we're trying to minimize here, and you can see on this site, on the Santiago fire, that vegetation actually, regrowth was very slow compared to the other sites I'll show you in a minute. And there was plenty of bare ground on the untreated sites in the first couple years after the fire here because of the low regrowth. Eventually you see bare ground decreasing as organics increase, and the treatment eventually disappears after about 2 years. Little different situation here on the Gap fire where, again, you get a great reduction in bare ground immediately after the treatment, which is what the mitigation measure is striving for. The organic material just exploded in the second year, and the amount of bare ground decreased. The treatment, again, went away after about, in this case, 1 year. Finally, the Heceta fire. Again, at the time of site establishment, the treatment really reduced the amount of bare ground compared to the control sites. The vegetation on regrowth on this site was phenomenal, and to tell you the truth, the amount of organic matter that we were seeing just even in the first year after the fire was pretty amazing. Looking at the erosion results here for this Santiago site, again, this is the one that did not revegetate very easily. You can see the first year, there's bars there in asterisks, which means that we had an unusual thunderstorm that actually overtopped our silt fences, and these are minimum values only that, to tell you the truth, really reflect the size of the fence capacity more than anything else. So the apparent difference there in erosion rates is a little, all right, it's not really, it's more apparent than real. But you can see that the site still remains in an elevated sediment production condition because of the lack of vegetation regrowth until about the 4th year. You can see on the top the rainfall inputs for each year, the annual rainfall totals in millimeters on the top, the percent of normal compared to a long-term gauge, and the 10-minute peak intensities. And it was that 70 millimeter per hour 10-minute intensity that overtopped our silt fences. On the Gap fire, you can see that there was a substantial reduction in sediment because of the hydromulch, about 60%. Here, it remained elevated, or the erosion remained elevated for just 2 years because of the regrowth that was experienced. You can see there was a little bit of treatment effect in the second year here as well. And finally, the Heceta site, you can see there's like an 80% reduction in erosion the first post-fire year, and nothing after that because of the regrowth explosion that was experienced on the site. The vegetation response is measured by these various metrics here. Percent cover is in red, the foliar cover this time. And because the vegetation layers can overlap, you can get percent cover greater than 100. The other metrics there are seedling counts and species richness, which are both on the right-hand scale there, numbers per plot. So on the Santiago site, which experienced fairly poor regrowth, you can see that the foliar component increased to about the third post-fire year, then declined because of the nature of the herbaceous vegetation that comes in immediately after a fire that then crashes when the climax chaparral vegetation rises to the fore. Seedling count, there was really no difference, and species richness, even though there is a slight difference, according to the graph, it's not statistically significant. Gap fire, you can see the foliar vegetation peak the second post-fire year with the rise of the herbaceous vegetation there and continued to decrease. There's really no difference in seedling counts or species richness across the board there. And the ACC fire, again, with a spectacular regrowth, the foliar percent cover was the greatest the first year after the fire and declined after that. There was no difference in really species richness or seedlings at this site. If anything, it looks like the hydromulch actually did better. So we can see that the hydromulch initially reduced bare ground on all sites, and some of this cover persisted through the first post-fire year. The treatment mostly disappeared by the end of the second post-fire year, which is what it's designed to do. Hydromulch substantially reduced erosion during the first post-fire year at the Gap and Jesus sites, as we saw. Similar results were initially seen at the Santiago site before the site was overwhelmed by a thunderstorm, as I mentioned. And all sites returned to baseline erosion levels within 2 to 4 years, which has implications for managers who are concerned with post-fire recovery. As far as the vegetation is concerned, the hydromulch caused no substantial differences in vegetation measures. There was no evidence that any species were eliminated or suppressed, and any minor differences were attributed to inherent site characteristics. So in conclusion, the hydromulch substantially reduced first-year post-fire erosion on Southern California chaparral sites for small and moderate storms, but not for an extreme event. And the hydromulch was environmentally benign with respect to vegetation. And with that, I'm done, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Again, the speaker's exactly on time, so we have time, 2 minutes for questions.
Yes?
In terms of volume of sediment or erosion avoided per acre versus cost per acre, how does that break out?
All right, well, all these treatments are very costly, and to tell you the truth, they're comparable, or the hydromulch is very expensive, and how much do you save by putting it on there, to tell you the truth, remains to be seen. A cost-effective comparison really needs to be done, and it also, besides just the amount of erosion and the cost of trucking it away, it probably needs to also include some other attributes that would go into that economic equation, but that work still needs to be done.
Do you have an estimate of the cost?
The hydromulch costs like about $4,000 an acre to put down on the ground. So for the Santiago fire, they spent $5 million. For the Gap site, they spent $5 million. For the ACC site, they only spent $750,000. But they only treated like 200 acres. Yes?
Logistically, to apply the treatment, do you need to be near a road, or can you apply it?
The hydromulch goes on by air, as you saw with that fixed-wing aircraft. It can also be used with a helicopter, and these are operational things. We didn't put these on. The Bear implementation team did this, and we were just following around behind them, evaluating their treatment effectiveness. Other questions?
Did you see on your control sites, were you getting rilling? What type of erosion processes were dominating there?
On the Santiago site that got hosed by the thunderstorm, there was fabulous rilling and complete stripping of the soil. And the one site was also a hydromulch site. It got completely removed by this thunderstorm as well. To tell you the truth, some of the other sites, we didn't get extensive rilling, which has actually surprised me because that's one of the most characteristic features of post-fire landscapes in Southern California. And I was surprised not to see more extensive rilling than I saw.
So I just did the quick calculations, just guessing an estimate of about 10 megagrams a hectare difference in sediment production, and you talked about $4,000 an acre, and so it works out to be about $1 a kilogram, more or less.
All right, I'm not sure the Forest Service would think that's money well spent or not, but the bottom line here is that it's very expensive. You would only use it in areas that you had high value risks down below and the expectation that other treatments wouldn't work.
So by my calculation, I'm worth about $90. Good. So we'll change topics now. One of the other things that Scott Woods worked on was roads. That was one of his first papers. And we have Beverly Wemple talking to us about assessing the effects of unpaved road networks on downstream water quality in a forested upland landscape, a multi-scale approach.
Okay, thanks to the session conveners. I was trying to figure out how I was going to explain why I wasn't working on fire. I want to start by acknowledging my co-authors, students Gordon Clark and Scott Hamshaw, and my colleagues Don Ross, Donna Rizzo, and Leslie Morrissey, who's here in the audience. I'll start my presentation by giving you a little bit of context because we're going to move to a new geography here. We are working in the Lake Champlain Basin. Let's see, is this pointer working? Oh, okay. We're working in the Lake Champlain Basin, which is about a 20,000 square kilometer international river basin, lake basin that spans the states of Vermont and New York and the province of Quebec in Canada. The lake is a very important resource for the region in terms of water supplies, recreational resources, aquatic habitat, and so on. But it's also on the impaired waters list in both the states of Vermont and New York. For algal blooms that occur in the lake. And the pollutant of concern is phosphorus, but there's also a great deal of concern about sediment since most of the phosphorus is adhered to sediment. Much of what we know about pollutant loading to the lake revolves around the sources of agriculture in the lowlands. There's increasingly well-documented evidence that migrating rivers from the lowlands up into the upland settings are important sources of pollution to the lake. But the uplands of the watershed are mostly forested, and until relatively recently, the prevailing thinking has been that the uplands really just don't contribute to pollution of the lake. But despite that thinking, there is a pretty dense network of unpaved roads in the uplands that represent about 60 to 70% of the total road network length above elevations of about 1,000 feet. And there's a lot of evidence that roads are a pretty important erosional source in these upland settings. In the broader context, we and our research group and also land management agencies in our region are really trying to understand the various sources of pollutant loading into the lakes. And so I've developed this sort of conceptual model of a sediment budget for one river, the Winooski River, which I'm going to talk about today, within the Lake Champlain Basin to sort of try and put this in a framework. Long-term monitoring in the Winooski River watershed indicates that the loads of sediment to the lake are about 340 kilograms per hectare per year. Sources of this include those agricultural fields in the lowlands and also some small urban areas. In the uplands, we have sort of a modest, very minor contribution from forested hill slopes. And increasingly importantly, well understood source of erosion and pollutant production is these eroding stream banks, which Leslie is working on and presented on earlier this week. And the work that I'm going to talk about today is really around trying to quantify the importance of gravel roads within this sort of sediment budgeting framework. Okay, so the approach that we have used spans two spatial scales within the Lake Champlain Basin. We have this broad scale inventory of roads that we've conducted in the Winooski River watershed, and then a finer scale study on individual road segments within the Mad River watershed, one of the 7 tributary watersheds to the Winooski. In my presentation, I'm going to start, I'm having a hard time with this pointer. I'm going to start with the results in the Winooski Basin inventory, and then I'll go on and talk about this work in the Mad River. So for this watershed-wide inventory within the Winooski River watershed, we surveyed 52 road segments, each about 2 kilometers in length. Along each road segment, we mapped individual erosional features, primarily rills, gullies, and eroded ditch lines. All total, when we mapped those, we measured the width, length, and depth of those features, and also took some bulk density measurements in order to be able to convert those volume estimates into a mass of sediment. All total, we mapped about 1,000 features along that 100 kilometers of road that we surveyed, typically sort of on the order of about 10 to 20 features per kilometer of road, of relatively small volumes. Most were between 5 and 20 cubic meters per kilometer, a mode of about 7 cubic meters per kilometer. Okay, in order to scale up that inventory to the scale of the entire Winooski Basin, we did a series of calculations that look like this. For each surveyed road segment, we summed the volume of the individual features and normalized those by the segment of road length that we had surveyed for unit volume eroded per road segment. And then we took the mean of those for the 52 surveyed segments, multiplied that by a bulk density, a mean bulk density, to get a mean unit mass eroded from roads, and then estimated the mass flux from the road network as the mean of this individual road segment times the length of the road network. And I'm going to present some of these mass fluxes on a subwatershed by subwatershed basis. So here's what the volume of material looks like across these 7 tributary watersheds in the main stem here, ranging from about 1.5 cubic meters per kilometer to over 20 cubic meters per kilometer of sediment eroded from the road surfaces. This is scaled up to the entire road network in each of these tributary catchments. That variability appears to be pretty highly controlled by slope, with the highest volumes of material eroded from the steepest watersheds, the Little River and Mad River. The spine of the Green Mountains runs right along here, with Vermont's highest peaks located here and here. So we're in a fairly steep landscape in some of these subwatersheds. If we take those estimates, multiply them, these are volume estimates, multiply them by the bulk density that we've measured in the field, and then by the length of the road network in each of these subwatersheds, that gives us an estimate of the mass of sediment eroded from each of these subwatersheds. And that ranges, from, let's see, a low value here in the North Branch to the highest value here in the Mad River. And the total across all of these subwatersheds in the main stem is about 40,000 metric tons. Now, I'm calling this a year's load here, and we're told that that's probably a pretty safe assumption based on our survey methods, because the road network is pretty heavily maintained. These are municipal roads that are maintained at least once annually and regraded by road crews. If I take that estimate and divide it out by the area of the Winooski River watershed and normalize that by a year, I get an estimate of about 140 kilograms per hectare per year. And if I put this back into the context of my sediment budget, that 140 kilograms per hectare per year looks like a pretty big number relative to this. But I haven't said anything about connectivity yet. And so if we took a really sort of back-of-the-envelope estimate of roads that are actually connected into the stream network, maybe about a third of the road network, and I could talk more about that in questions if you have some, that brings us to an estimate of about, I am really having a hard time with this pointer, an estimate of about 47 kilograms per hectare per year. So that's a little under 15% of the basin sediment yield. So maybe we're getting into a number that's somewhat believable. All right, this spatially distributed approach also gives us an opportunity to look at what we might think of as hotspots of sediment production from roads. So on this graphic here, I've plotted on the left the entire road network expressed as a percentage for each of these tributary catchments, and then that total sediment mass that we estimate eroded from roads expressed as a percentage across each of the subcatchments. And what you can see here is that these two relatively gently sloped subcatchments represent about 40% of the road network, but only contribute about 20% of the sediment that we estimate, whereas these two much more steeply sloped subcatchments represent only about 25% of the road network, but over 50% of the sediment contributed. Okay, so that broad-scale survey gives us some sort of order of magnitude estimate of the importance of roads, but we really wanted to look at smaller-scale storm-based dynamics. So the second part of our study involved sampling on a set of 12 road segments located within 5 tributary catchments within the Mad River Valley. We instrumented the inlets of culverts with a V-notch weir, pressure transducer, and connected these to ISCO water samplers so we could sample for water quality during storm events. You're seeing flow passing through the culvert here during an event. We are also coupling these measurements that we're making on road segments, and I'll show you some of those in the next slide, with an ongoing water quality sampling program that's conducted by the local Watershed group. So they are measuring total suspended sediment and also phosphorus and E. coli in each of these tributary catchments and all along the river each year, and we've taken their mean concentrations to develop a loading estimate for each of these tributary catchments. Here's what the storm behavior looks like for 5 roads for which we have sampling over one storm in October of 2011. You can see a fair amount of variability across the sites. One site that has a peak runoff rate of only about 1/4 of a liter per second of runoff, another that has peak runoff of almost 6 liters per second. The suspended sediment concentrations vary over a fairly wide range, but typically between about 10 and 1,000 milligrams per liter, but can vary all the way up to several orders of magnitude above that. Okay, so to scale these measurements at the site scale up to the road network for the Mad River, what we are doing is taking those concentration and discharge measurements that we're measuring over storm events, multiplying the concentration by discharge, and integrating over discrete time intervals to get an estimate of event mass flux at a site. We normalize that by the event rainfall and by the length of road contributing to that site for a normalized event mass flux. And then we take, for a set of storms that we have sampled, an average of that event mass flux, multiply it by the annual rainfall, and then multiply that by the sum of the length of the road network and the catchment for a catchment scale estimate. Here's a look at the suspended sediment yield from roads that we estimate using those calculations for 9 of the 12 road segments. Looks like there's a pretty strong control of road grade, which we would expect on those yields. Because we want to scale these estimates and we don't have a great deal of confidence in our network-wide ability to estimate road grade, we've taken the relatively simple approach of using an average for low gradient roads and an average for high gradient roads of these magnitudes, and then multiplied those by the length of the road network and divided by the area in each of the subcatchments for an estimate of sediment flux mass from the roads across these 5 subcatchments. And if we take these estimates of flux and plot them against the river flux out of these subcatchments, we see that roads constitute about 20% of the load out of these 5 subcatchments that we're working in. Okay, so if I take this back to my conceptual sediment budget, then I can refine the numbers that I showed you earlier a bit and say that our estimates here are about 16 to 45 kilograms per hectare per year from roads, a little bit lower than I've got here, but sort of in the same order of magnitude, but representing potentially a larger fraction of the river load because we're working in tributaries with a slightly lower load than we're seeing down in the Winooski. So to wrap up, I'll just say that the sediment budgeting framework that we're working within provides a useful context to evaluating how important roads are, which is really what we're trying to get at. That we are conducting these investigations at multiple spatial scales because we think that this provides some important insights and also allows us to corroborate our results, and that the roads in this landscape appear to represent something like 15 to 20% of the sediment flux in receiving waters, and therefore probably an important phenomenon to take a look at. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, the speaker's done a wonderful job, so we have time for questions.
Beverly, could you give us a perspective on the type of erosional features that you're mapping? I mean, this is pretty drastic, and I think what I'm getting at is we're not adding here sheet flow.
Yeah,
this
sure.
Could be also another component.
Yeah, so the question is what kinds of features are you actually mapping on roads? I should have said that when I presented on the inventory results. We mapped rills, gullies, and eroded ditch lines, and so there were, in many cases where the volumes are quite small, it's because of more prominent rill erosion. In other cases, we have really dramatic eroded ditch lines, so it sort of spans the gamut. Is there a question in the back? Go ahead.
What are the grain size distributions of the
That's a really good question. We're working on that now. We've got one of my students is back in the lab working this week on that, because that inventory estimate probably has some coarse enough grain sizes that they're actually not contributing to suspended load. So I don't have an answer for you, but it's a good question and one we're working on. Thanks.
Over your period of measurement, what was the storm intensity or the frequency of events that affected the results?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but they also spanned a pretty wide range. In August of 2011, we were hit by Tropical Storm Irene, and this eroded ditch is a result of that. But we also had some pretty low-intensity storms, too, and I showed you averages sort of smeared across the entire field season, but we're really trying to disentangle those and apply those according to the storm dynamics.
One more question?
Would you say that because you were looking at gravel roads, that maybe that represents kind of a best case scenario in terms of if you compared it to a bare road?
Yeah, or like a forest road.
Yeah, like maybe what are the implications for improving sediment yield from those?
Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. I'm not sure. I will say that, you know, if you think about Leslie Reed's work and how she documented the importance of traffic, these roads are really heavily trafficked because they're town roads and not just logging roads. So my sense is they're probably pretty heavy producers of sediment. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I'll give you a story. When Beverly was starting her PhD, she said she was going to work on roads, and she was really worried that it wouldn't be interesting. And look at the interest she's got already, still umpteen years later. So, but Drew Coe can give you some numbers on gravel roads. Anyhow, so we'll move on to start talking about forest management issues. So the next talk is by Mr. Moore, and it's going to be runoff generation and soil erosion processes after clear cuttings.
So thank you. Thank you for organizing this session, and thank you to the previous speakers about the interesting topics. To begin my talk with, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Andres Irumea and Anton Huber from Chile, and Axel Bronsted, my PhD supervisor from Potsdam University. To start with, in this talk, I'd like to figure out how harvest areas itself work if they act rather as sources or sinks for runoff and soil erosion processes. Well, there's quite a big agreement that forest roads, timber roads, and skidder trails are the main sources for runoff, both runoff and erosion. It's quite still ambiguous about the hydrological and erosional behavior of harvest areas itself. It depends completely on the study. So I found, for example, that studies consider harvest areas as sinks, while others, quite similar studies, consider them as sources. So I'm asking, so if they act rather as sources or sinks, or probably if they may even switch around thresholds, and this means that their behavior can dynamically alternate between. The study area we are working in is in south-central Chile, about 500 kilometers south of Santiago, close to the city of Concepcion in the coastal mountain range. In this area, we installed a network of 11 experimental catchments. However, in this talk, I only will restrict my presentation to 3 catchments, which are outlined here. And I forgot to mention, in my work, I try to link somehow different scales, and I work on catchment scale and conducted some small-scale rainfall experiments. To give you a little bit better impression about the study area, how it looks like, here's San Antonio catchment number 1. This one remained completely untreated during the study period, and it remained as Pinus radiata plantation. However, it has been previously rotated about 20-25 years ago. This one is hereafter called SA Pre, and in the middle, San Antonio catchment number 3. This one is a catchment recently clear-cut in 2009, and I will refer to it hereafter as San Antonio Post, SA Post. And on the right-hand side, you see here some impression about a quite old clear-cut, which has been logged in 2006, and hereafter been laid fallow by artificial means. Hence, I got some kind of experimental setup dealing with control conditions without any interventions and clear-cut of different ages. The catchment scale monitoring system includes stream flow discharge, which has been measured, as you can see here, by V-notch weirs equipped with water stage loggers, while sediment flux is estimated in this study here based on event-based sampling of suspended sediment. The rainfall simulation we conducted were on small scale. The area is about half a square meter only, and it's actually a modified drip-type rainfall simulator. And we tried to adapt as good as possible our sampling designs designed to the local conditions. And here in this plot, you see the maximum 30-minute rainfall intensity, the cumulative frequency of it, and you probably can figure out that the mean is about 10 millimeters per hour, and there's only little rainfall occurring with intensities exceeding about 25 millimeters. So we decided to simulate with 10 millimeters per hour and 20, but additional we added an intensity of 40 to accentuate potential differences in hydrological and erosional responses. The data we got then in the field were analyzed with a random forest approach. This is a quite robust non-parametric tree-based technique. And I think the biggest advantage of it is that it is capable to handle nonlinear, noisy, intercorrelated, or even fragmented data. And the goal of this analysis was then to quantify the relevant underlying and environmental variables controlling hydrological and erosional responses on the small scale. Now I'd like to show you some main results we found here. On the right-hand side, you see the plot showing runoff yield normalized to a square meter. And I'd like to mention that this includes all the runoff we sampled during the first 120 minutes of the experiment as a function of applied intensity. And I'd like to draw your attention to two main findings. I think it's quite counterintuitive, actually, that this SA pre, so the conditions, the pre-logging conditions seem to produce more runoff. And this means then in turn that after logging infiltration increased. And this is quite counterintuitive and contrasting to most of the previous studies. The next finding, or I think the even more exciting finding in this plot, is probably better understandable on the other side. Here I try to compare relatively the hydrological response of the two clear cuts. And this is only calculated the mean runoff yield ratio over the rainfall intensity. And by this runoff yield ratio, I mean I just divided the runoff yield of the recent clear cut by the one of the old clear cut. And you see a very nice linear relationship. And interestingly, there seems to be some kind of threshold rainfall intensity when the system starts to switch, meaning that exceeding this threshold, the recent clear cut seems to produce more runoff than the old one. As a next step, I'd like to explore a little bit about the underlying environmental controls, probably to find some predictors that are suitable, feasible to explain the hydrological response. And here in the upper part is the model fit, and I think we all agree that it's a really poor model fit. However, more interesting is the part at the bottom, which shows the variable importance. And this is a measure of the random forest statistical model to highlight the importance of a variable, meaning, for example, that rainfall intensity here has an impact of more than 30%, meaning if you put this variable out of the ensemble of variables, the model performance decreases by roughly 30%. And I think it's not very surprisingly that rainfall intensity is the most important predictor in this case. But I think what is very striking is that the recent land use doesn't seem to have a really strong impact on the hydrological response. So I think these are the more or less I think that is the most important finding, that the recent land use in this sense doesn't have so much impact on it. However, until now we only dealt on small scale, and I was curious about the hydrological response on catchment scale. And here in the upper four plots, you see hydrographs showing discharge over time for the year 2008 and 2009. For catchment 1, this is the one without any treatment, and catchment 3 that has been clear-cutted here as indicated by the reddish dashed lines. And you see it's quite flashy, and the hydrological response is very similar. This is expressed in the lower part of the plot, which is the ratio between the daily discharge between both catchments. So it's quite constant around 1 and only varying a little bit. However, this changed completely after logging, and you see here with this that the ratio got up after logging, indicating that there is less runoff after the logging. And this in turn also confirms enhanced infiltration and hereby groundwater recharge after the logging. And I think this is quite counterintuitive to the normal studies you probably find. In the next minutes, I'd like to address some words about the sediment transport. And here on this side, on this plot, is more or less in principle the same as the runoff yield, only that I summed up the sediment over the 120 minutes of occurring runoff, normalized it to surface. And I'd like to draw your attention to one point. You see here again indicated pre-logging conditions, the recent clear cut and the old clear cut, and there seems to be like a flexing point. And I once again calculated then the mean sediment yield ratio between both logged catchments, and it seems again to confirm that there's some kind of threshold behavior also in soil erosion processes, indicating an intensity of about 20 millimeters when the recent clear cut starts to outperform the older one in terms of sediment production. This plot, I kindly ask you not to stick too much on it. I only want to point out here in the predictor variables, I think an interesting finding. While under pre-logging conditions, it seems like the maximum erosion rate is very predictive for the overall sediment yield. It's not the case for the logged sites. However, under the previous and the recently logged sites, we additionally have at least some very, very slight impact of mean sediment concentration. And this in turn probably indicates some different behavior of erosion, in erosion regime or erosion patterns. Then I'd looked in the next step into the temporal patterns of the sediment flux, and indeed there are some differences in the erosion process, while here on the left-hand side, under pre-logging conditions, we see a very supply-limited erosion process, showing here the peak at the very beginning, while in the recently logged sites, we have more like a behavior more related to the runoff rates. It's like sediment transport is tracked by runoff, as you can see here over time, probably indicated by the red points. However, it's highly variable, and I don't want to be too strong about it. However, in the next step, I again looked on catchment scale, and I found at least some similar patterns on the pre-logging conditions, as indicated here by this clockwise hysteresis indicating supply-limited erosion process, while under the logged conditions, first of all, mind the scale, so it's order of magnitude more. We have some other processes occurring on catchment scale too, besides the sheet erosion, obviously. And this can be seen here by the strong sediment pulse, probably a point source, coming into the system during the recession. And in the area, we mapped a lot of landslides occurring after the logging, and probably this can be associated. So, finally, I'd like to come to my conclusions. Interestingly, and quite surprisingly, at least for me, I found that infiltration increased after the loggings, and I suggest two underlying mechanisms probably. The one is more related to the disturbance of the water-repellent forest floor by the logging activities, and this can be indicated in this plot. This is, again, a variable importance plot of the random forest model, but restricted only to pre-logging conditions, and you see some impact of antecedent dry period, probably the antecedent dry water-repellent forest floor controlling some kind of runoff forest. And here, in this photo, I'd like to show you the connectivity issue probably, meaning that with the threshold intensity exceeding 20 millimeters, surface runoff overcomes the accentuated microtopography, and hereby enhancing surface runoff only under this newly locked conditions. And finally, it seems like I didn't find any strong environmental control. Probably it's just a legacy of former logging activities that is so persistent and controls the hydrological response. And to come back to my question at the beginning, if harvest areas act rather as sources or sinks, I think I only can say it completely depends. And moreover, it's getting more complicated that it seems like this whole system may switch between both behaviors. Thank you. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to founding agencies, to students for helping in work, and some people in Chile. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one question.
Yeah.
Some of the other studies have indicated that let's say the pattern that they do the logging, the direction of the skid trails has a big influence on the sediment yield or the change in the runoff response. Do you have any comments about that?
I think it's quite important, sure, but with the sampling design we used, it was two-stage random sampling in the area. We couldn't find any consistent pattern related to these tracks. So I think probably the disturbance is so persistent due to former loggings that they are too important to find any other recent environmental controls. But this is just a guess and probably an interesting thing to look at.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So continuing on with the topic of forest management issues, the next talk is by Drew Coe, a rapid assessment of logging-associated sediment delivery pathways in an intensively managed forested watershed in the Southern Cascades, Northern California. I think he simplified the title, so we should use that one, Rapid Assessment of Sediment Delivery. Yeah.
I think my co-author will be mad that I altered that title, but I do think it's quite a bit simpler and it kind of flows off the tongue a little bit better. So first of all, I wanted to acknowledge some of my co-authors. As you can see here, we're comprised of 4 state regulatory agencies, and we basically have regulatory oversight over private timber harvest in California, specifically the Central Valley region of California. It's sometimes rare for our various agencies to actually work and collaborate together, and I'll go into the reason why we did that for this talk. If you noted the previous slide, our group was called the Battle Creek Task Force, and the area that I'm going to talk about today is the Battle Creek Watershed. It's a watershed in Northern California. It flows off the western flanks of Mount Lassen, which is the southern terminus of the Southern Cascades. It's about a 960 square kilometer watershed with elevations ranging from about 100 meters down at the mouth at the confluence of the Sacramento River to 3,200 meters at the top of Mount Lassen. And the gradation in precipitation ranges from about 1,000 millimeters at the mouth to probably over 2,500 millimeters on the flanks of Lassen itself. The kind of unique and special thing about Battle Creek is that it is considered the crown jewel of anadromy in the Sacramento Valley watershed. And a lot of hopes and dreams have been placed into this watershed in terms of bringing back spring run Chinook salmon in the future. Back to the reason why we got together as a task force. Emergency du jour. And in the policy setting, when newspaper articles come out, then the people get mobilized. And in this case, a series of articles came out in the Sacramento Bee, both editorials and articles suggesting that clear cutting and intensive forest management was causing water quality impacts and impacting that very expensive restoration project on Battle Creek. Now, to provide you some management context, the largest landowner in the watershed is Sierra Pacific Industries. They're the second largest timber company in the United States. They predominantly own most of the private forest land in the watershed, and over the last 10 to 12 years, they've increasingly employed even-age silviculture, clear cutting, with about 8,000 hectares being harvested within that time frame. The other thing of note is that it's done under the guise of the California Forest Practice Rules, which rely heavily on BMP implementation and enforcement. So kind of given this background, our task force were given the job of seeing whether there was sediment delivery associated with this intensive forest management to Battle Creek. And sediment delivery we're going to talk about today is overland sediment delivery. We're not going to talk about indirect sediment from hydrologic impacts. This was a rapid assessment, so we have no paired watershed studies set up in this watershed. Methods we employed were basically a rapid, almost sediment budget type technique. We wanted to prioritize areas that had the highest risk for sediment delivery. That included areas with the highest runoff and sediment producing potential. And then we also wanted to go to areas that were closest to the stream. It makes sense that things right next to the stream have a higher probability of delivering sediment than something up on a ridgetop. The other thing that so given that kind of conceptual framework, there's a couple things that kind of were low-hanging fruit. Things like clear cutting, where you have compacted surfaces, low surface cover, and a lot of dirt being pushed around by heavy machines. You also have, of course, roads. Roads they're a pretty obvious source of sediment in forested watersheds as well. So for each of these sites, we went out there and we assessed, was it delivering sediment? Yes or no question. Once we found a sediment delivery pathway, we tried to link it to some sort of erosion source and some kind of delivery pathway, such as rilling, debris sliding, gulling. And then we tried to do a very quick site characterization to look at site controls as well as the linkage to land use. So from 132 sites that we visited, including 55 discrete harvest units, as you can see here from the graph, we found one site out of the clear-cut units that delivered sediment, and roughly 67 to 69% associated with road crossings and road segments. And you can see at the right end of the graph, tractor crossings and land needs. We don't have a very large sample size, but that suggests that we have sediment delivery from some of those features as well. Again, percentage-wise, tractor crossings had the highest, 100%, although sample size of 5. Again, 67 to 69%, depending on whether it's a road crossing or road segment. And again, 2% for clear-cut units. One of the things that we wanted to do was to look at delivery magnitude. We used kind of a binned relative magnitude. We use cubic yards. I'm sorry I have to break it to you. We use standard units in the regulatory sector, but 0 to 1 cubic yard was we used for low, 1 to 10 for moderate, and over 10 for high. And that equates to be about 0.75 cubic meters, 7.5, 75 cubic meters. So if you look here at the magnitude, road crossings and road segments were more likely to deliver both moderate and high magnitudes of sediment. And the one sediment delivery site we saw with clear cutting just delivered a low amount of sediment. The one site we found was a result of an encroachment of a machine into a equipment limitation zone. It wasn't actually runoff derived from the clear cut itself and sediment. It was from a machine pushing a pile of dirt into a riparian buffer, and then that material basically sheet eroding into the stream. So why no sediment delivery from clear cuts? Basically BMP implementation. We found that strategic skidding and effective drainage using water bars really limited runoff production and erosion. And Sierra Pacific uses a practice called contour ripping, where it's exactly how it sounds. They take a giant Caterpillar tractor with 4-foot deep subsoil rippers, and they just rip on contour. And what this does is it really creates a lot of surface roughness, and you basically have a little sediment detention area every 2 or 3 feet down the hill slope. So that really limits hill slope length, which is a determinant for erosion. And the surface cover also remains relatively high. They incorporate a lot of the organic material with those ripper cats and in the site preparation phase. So there's relatively high surface cover on these clear-cut areas. And then also with things like water barring and stuff, if there is any kind of runoff generation, it's directed to undisturbed areas with high roughness, and that runoff is quickly infiltrated. And then also the riparian buffers seem to be very effective at filtering out sediment. The longest travel distance I saw was about 6 meters coming off of a unit into a stream buffer. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about road stream crossings, which were a larger source of sediment delivery as well as and sediment magnitude. Most sediment generally came from crossing approaches, and rocked approaches generally delivered much less sediment than native surface roads. And then roads behind gates were also less likely to produce a lot of sediment or have sediment delivery, and that's basically because the BMPs can hold up and they're more persistent over time without high levels of traffic. The publicly maintained roads and things like county roads where there are sometimes no BMPs implemented at all, those are often problem areas. This is an illustration of a road approach draining down to a stream. This was the most common form of sediment delivery at road crossings. So rocking features like this would be very important to reduce sediment delivery. Stream adjacent roads are roads within the riparian zone, and the largest source of sediment we found was a road that was right on top of a stream, essentially no buffering capacity between the stream and the road, and that was not a real common occurrence, but when it happened, there was large magnitudes of sediment delivery. These areas can be mitigated by rocking sometimes, but if you're very, very close to a stream, it's often unmitigatable. Tractor crossing and landings, they're a small, we had small sample sizes, but what we found is that almost all tractor crossings produce and deliver sediment, and that's basically because the process involves filling a stream with earth and fill material. They skid logs across it, and then they remove it all, and they can never quite remove enough. So there's always a little bit of post-channel adjustment, usually of low magnitude. And then only one landing out of 6 that we evaluated actually delivered sediment, but it was a legacy landing that was pretty much right on top of a stream. So why the relatively low impact from clear cutting in the watershed? Well, first of all, Battle Creek is a young volcanic landscape, and young volcanic landscapes are characterized by highly permeable terrain and also relatively low drainage density and relatively gentle slopes. This area, this polygon here, actually has every watercourse mapped on it. They're required to do that in the timber harvest planning process. And as you can see here, there's about a 45 square kilometer area that has no watercourses associated with them whatsoever. So it's hard to have sediment delivery when you have no watercourses or channels. This is a slope map of the watershed, and as you can see, the yellow, light yellow, is slopes under 30% slope. And mass wasting is not a dominant process in this watershed, and a lot of the sediment delivery you see in the literature is associated with mass wasting, and we just don't really have that in the Battle Creek watershed. So again, just to reinforce that, relatively high permeability likely reduces runoff potential, and it actually makes BMPs more effective. You can infiltrate the runoff more effectively with highly permeable soils. Also, gentle slopes limit the erosion potential of logging activities, and relatively gentle slopes means that mass wasting is a minor process. Assessment limitations. We did assess, our assessment was based on identifying high priority sites, so if you were to just randomly select across the watershed, you would probably find lower delivery rates. And we were also unable to look at the indirect impacts of clear cutting. The other thing is that the clear cuts were only subjected to average and below average winter seasons during the time of the assessment. And also, it's hard to see rills and gullies over time. They sometimes fill in, they sometimes get obscured by vegetation. So in conclusion, clear cuts did not deliver sediment when the BMPs were implemented. Sediment delivery from roads was minimized by implementing BMPs, surfacing roads or relocating roads. And generally, the low drainage density of the watershed limits sediment delivery from forestry activities. And that question again of are they sources or sinks, I think that question really, or the answer really can change once you have things like wildfire move through the system. And we had this moderate and high severity wildfire move through this summer in the watershed, and last week we were just hit with probably multi-decadal recurrence interval floods. So these are would be important things to reassess in this watershed over time.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Drew? We have time for one question. Bob?
Yes, through this contour ripping, are they just doing this on the roads or skid trails and landings, or they rip the whole park?
They rip, if the topography is favorable, they'll rip the entire unit. Yeah.
This is beneficial.
It looks terrible, but you're hard pressed to see sediment move in about 2 or 3 feet. If it's done on contour, if it's done off of contour, you can run into troubles, but their operators are pretty good.
I envision how that contour ripping might be effective at reducing sedimentation from small to medium-sized storms, but have you looked at its effectiveness at really large storms? It seems like it could exacerbate it when you
That's a very interesting question, and it's one that we might be able to start answering fairly soon. It's going to be, we can answer that question maybe in a post-fire environment because there's currently a experiment set up. What I've seen out in the field, though, is that in a post-fire environment, the ripping does mitigate relative to a control. And yeah, I mean, because we had about 100 millimeter storm over about a 3 to 4 hour period, and I think that's right up there in terms of recurrence intervals for that watershed. So that's preliminary, but it does suggest that the contour ripping does hold up for those more intense storms.
Our last presenter today is Lee McDonald, and on behalf of Pete, Vicky, and myself, I want to thank Lee for providing the fire, if you will, for making this happen, bringing this topic, a very management-oriented topic, to AGU, and also for honoring somebody that was very close to his heart, Scott Woods. The title of Lee's talk is Effects of Forest Management and Roads on Runoff, Erosion, and Water Quality, the Judd Creek Experiment.
Thank you, Carlos. The previous 2 speakers have actually made my job quite easy. I'd like to acknowledge that I am working with Sierra Pacific Industries, and my co-author for this is Cajun James, who's the head of monitoring and research for Sierra Pacific. Oops, try this one. So the outline for the talk, I'm actually going to change things a lot, and I've never done this in my 28 years at AGU, but I'm going to reduce this talk because the results basically support what Drew said and actually what the previous speaker said. And we had nearby areas to this Judd Creek watershed burned in August, and then were subjected to a very large storm this last weekend. And I've been working on roads and fires for a long time. I started off as a hydrologist, turned into an erosion guy. And it turns out that I think roads and fires are really much bigger issue than timber harvest, and that's just what Drew showed. So I'm going to do a very quick summary of my original talk, and then focus on fires, trying to take a big picture approach to identify key research needs. In other words, what would Scott have done if he had continued on, and what might I do if I really want to stay unretired, which seems to be my problem at this point. So there's the Battle Creek watershed, and if we can, here's the little Judd Creek watershed just below there, which is the steady watershed that I was going to talk about. 18 square kilometers, young volcanics, so again, highly permeable, the company began monitoring runoff, turbidity, and suspended sediment in 2001. They did the road work in 2007, closed a bunch of roads next to the streams, opened some new roads to get to the harvest units, and then they harvested about 16% of the watershed in a bunch of clear cuts that were 8 to 12 hectares according to the forest practice rules in California with buffer strips and the rest of it. So here's a map of the entire planning watershed, the actual timber harvest plan if you want, and you can see all the little green clear cuts, 5 water quality monitoring stations and stage monitoring, flow monitoring, so lots of data, a little chunk of private land in the middle. But this is what a typical clear cut looks like. Again, like Drew said, there's generally a lot of cover. They use a lot of herbicides, so there's not a lot of other green stuff growing except for the baby trees, at least for the first few years. Contour ripping, a lot of interest there. So this is what it looks like on the ground. This doesn't look like it's on the contour, but I think it actually is. It's just a funny angle of the picture. And then there's the landings, and they put water bars on the landings, and you can see here that the water bar helped contribute to the Rill development for the water running off the landing because it's highly compacted and not a lot of infiltration. And then we put up about 30 sediment fences to measure road surface erosion. And then we did 23 kilometers of detailed road surveys to try and look at the connectivity, how much of that road sediment might actually get to the stream. Just summary of the results. There is no evidence, again, of surface runoff or erosion from the clear cuts. 8 of the 43 landings had surface rills leading into sediment plumes draining off of them that were at least 10 meters long. If it wasn't 10 meters, we didn't bother. The longest was 24 meters, but none of them reached a stream channel, so we didn't have any delivery from the landings. And most of the unpaved road segments, of course, produce sediment, but it's relatively small amounts of sediment. Again, I think a more permeable landscape than most places. And the road stream connectivity was relatively low. The turbidity data, if you integrate over the entire time period, that only about 1% of the turbidity values was greater than 25 NTU, which is a pretty low number, but that's the impairment for site feeding of salmonids. The maximum value was, hourly value was just over 200 NTU, which isn't a really big number. And the values that were greater than 25 NTUs generally didn't persist very long, average 8 or 10 hours, and there are only a couple of days when it went for a full 24 hours. The catchment scale sediment yields we could calculate because we had turbidity and suspended sediment, very low values, again a very permeable landscape. And if you look at the sediment yields over time, there's no association whatsoever with either the road work or the timber harvest. And looking at the timber harvest and roads, there's not an indication that there's a lot of delivery in any case. So the hill slope and the in-stream stuff do generally match up. So that's that study. We're done. You can ask questions if you want afterwards. What I really wanted to talk about was the effects of fires on runoff, erosion, and geomorphology, key points and critical needs, because again, what we see is a dramatic effect of fires. If we look at, here's one of those swales that, remember we had the big fire next to the Jed Creek watershed. We set up 10 experimental swales, each about half a hectare. This is one of those swales after the storm last weekend. I think it was Drew that took this picture yesterday. Showing the rilling that's going on. A dramatic difference from the clear cuts, certainly. And here's the sediment fence, and there's a crew of 14 people as we speak out there now shoveling the sediment into buckets, weighing it so that we can get an actual sediment production rate from these. And just qualitatively, the ripped sites did produce way, way less sediment than the sites that were either controls, that is, weren't logged, or the ones that were logged. So, you know, I don't want to say that logging is great or ripping is wonderful, but the sediment production data seem to be leaning a certain way. So more generally, I'll talk about fires. Here's all the study sites that I've been working on in the Colorado Front Range, and then also doing some work in California and Montana, and then part of the reason for my lack of retirement, the High Park fire here just west of Fort Collins. Here's Fort Collins. It's kind of hard to ignore a 35,000 hectare fire in your backyard, and I can get to the nearest field site in 20 minutes from my house. And what the concern here is this river here is the Cache Laputa River. Fort Collins is known as the Napa Valley of beer. You start getting lots of stuff in the water, and the beer people get really upset quickly. They're pretty consistent about their water. And again, just to illustrate the effects of fires are pretty dramatic. This is a garden variety summer thunderstorm on the High Park fire this summer, and you just don't see this kind of overland flow in an unburned condition. So it's a very dramatic change in runoff processes and sediment production rates, and of course then all of this stuff accumulates and runs downstream into the river. And so there's a lot of worries about this. We have some pre-fire data because we started a project to look at the effects of thinning just before the Hayman fire. We set up some hill slope scale sediment fences and flumes and looked at the runoff at the watershed scale in a couple 6 to 8 square kilometers, watersheds, and had some cross sections. Most of these sites burned in the 2002 Hayman fire, which is our pre and post fire data. So this is just a picture to show a typical swale. If you look at the right-hand side there, there's a unthinned swale, and there's a little sediment fence in there. So these are the sites we were looking at. This is the sediment production in the summer before the fire, unburned condition. You can see we had 0 sediment production, so the students were very relaxed. They didn't have to do very much. Rainfall intensities, this is over time, over all the entire duration of the study, 566 storms, up to 64 millimeters an hour. Again, 0 sediment production, high infiltration rates, and we just don't get overland flow. But then after the fire, we had 17 millimeters of rain in 2 hours, and you can see that you start getting these rills developed in what was an unchanneled site before. Here's the rebar from our sediment fence that burned. It took a couple weeks to get them back up, and once we got them back up, this is what we got. 11 millimeters of precipitation in 45 minutes, and a bit of a different story than we had pre-fire. So we started measuring all the rill erosion. We could see these channel heads extending right up to the ridgetop there almost. And I'm sorry, we then measured the change in cross-sectional area from different cross-sections, and then we could calculate a volume, multiply it by the bulk density like Beverly did, and we get a mass. And it turns out that if we plot the mass of the sediment that we're getting from rill erosion versus the measured sediment in the fence, roughly 60 to 80% of the sediment originates from the rills. In the biggest storms, we start getting more hill slope erosion, but those hill slopes are producing the water, and the concentrated flow is producing the erosion, is the way we kind of view the world. So in terms of a hill slope evolution, we've got the high severity fire, then causing the side slope erosion, vegetative regrowth and armoring of the surface soil, so it reduces the hill slope runoff and erosion. We also, of course, get the rilling and gulling. So what we're getting is this landscape steepening in the headwater areas by a result of this incision, and we see the primary process as being the rilling and gulling rather than the side slope erosion by rain splash and sheet wash. And if we want to then look at kind of bigger scales, I think potentially there's a sweet spot in the Colorado Front Range where we have enough moisture, high enough elevations to get forests, but dry enough, low enough elevation so it burns at high severity and at relatively high frequencies, maybe less than 2,600 meters or so. And then we have this elevation zone where if we get too high, we don't have as much in the way of rainfall intensities and high intensity summer thunderstorms. So we have this combination that works together. And we should get a similar convergence of vegetation, likelihood of fires, and rainfall in other areas, say California, Sierra Nevada. And we can look for this signal in terms of greater landscape dissection and higher denudation rates. Through DEM analyses, do we see a different landscape signature? What's the frequency of high severity fires from fire scar analyses, charcoal deposits, cosmogenic isotopes to get long-term erosion rates? So we need to put these fires into a longer-term context. That's kind of at the hill slope scale. If we look downstream, again, here's these 2 watersheds that we instrumented to try and look at the effects of thinning. This is what the streams look like in 2001. Not really streams for a lot of people, but trickles. This is the giant flume we put in case we got the 100-year storm. So that's what it looked like after the first post-fire storm. Had the students clean it out. They weren't very happy. This is what it looked like after they cleaned it out. And then we had another storm, and this is what it looked like again. Completely buried by post-fire sediment. So here's the original cross-section. In the first month after burning, we had about 1.5 meters of deposition, and it just continued to accumulate. We have no incision through that at all because all the flow is through this material. It's so coarse that the flow is just subsurface at this point, and we're not getting And so then this stuff gets pushed out into the river. The river would actually get blocked by all the sediment coming out of these gulches. And then it would cut through and leave this alluvial fan. Denver Water just spent about $30 million to try and dredge Strontier Springs Reservoir to get rid of some of that sediment, but they only got about a quarter of it. Same thing happening on the High Gulch fire. Here's a cross-section I surveyed on 4th of July, and then we had a couple storm events, and again we get 0.5 meter or so of deposition, a tremendous mass of material because you multiply the area of this per unit length and you get big numbers. Again, we're seeing the same type of deposition upstream. We're getting a lot of fines and ash going into the river, but we're not getting the same sediment delivery from the High Park fire that we got after the Hayman fire. And that's really important. This downstream deposition, I think, is leading to a landscape flattening. Again, we need some landscape modelers, but the very limited sediment delivery after the High Park fire compared to the Hayman fire. Why is this important? Well, we're spending millions of dollars on fuels treatments to reduce fire risk. Well, if that sediment's not going to get to some place that we're worried about, then do we want to do that? We spent $23 million after the Hayman fire for post-fire treatments, $15 million after the High Park fire, but at least in the High Park fire, it doesn't seem like most of the sediment's getting to the river anyhow. So what are we really getting for these treatments? Whoops, sorry. So there's a critical need for watershed scale predictions to use models. We're doing the study with repeat LIDAR and other tools to estimate sediment storage and sediment delivery under different post-fire conditions, because we're going to get different results in different places. And I think we can hopefully crudely predict sediment delivery as a function of confinement, slope, the presence of riparian vegetation. I'm not sure particle size is all that crucial. That's, I think, where we need to go is this larger scale predictions. So we need to take our shorter term hill slope scale measurements into context, but over time, over space, compare fires to other sediment sources, both natural and anthropogenic. Roads are seeming to be very important and perhaps similar order of magnitude over long time periods in our Hayman study area. Evaluate sediment storage and delivery at larger scales, sediment budgets. So we have lots of work to do. And Scott, we really miss you. And I'm out of time, but maybe one question if anybody has anything really important. Otherwise, you can capture. Bob, go ahead.
How do you see climate change is playing into this? If stationarity is dead, we're going to have increasing frequency of extreme events, perhaps increasing drought and increasing wildfires. What does this mean in terms of long-range, long-term change in landscape evolution and morphology?
Well, I think we're going to see this critical sweet spot zone move up in California and Colorado. We're going to be at greater risk of, say, losing some of our productive capacity of soils as we get these more high severity fires, more intense rainfall events. I think, we're in big trouble, Bob. And I think it's too bad that I'm at this stage of my career, because I could do this fire stuff for another 40 years with more and more funding. So there's lots of potential for all you guys out there. I just would like to take this moment then and thank the speakers. You did a wonderful job, except for myself, of staying on time. I'd like to thank your participation very much, and I'd like to thank the audience for sticking around, because I know it's lunchtime and you're hungry. So again, thank you all.